you can use each of these modules. We're getting through 2 in a day. You can do them more quickly than that or more slowly than that. Normally, when we taught this in a day conference context, would take about 5 or 6 hours to get through the whole thing, and that would also include elements of role play as well. So the first thing I want you to do is to get into small groups again and think about this particular question. If someone asks you why you believe that Christianity is true, what possible lines of argument could you use? And I say possible lines because there are different lines of argument that are equally valid and biblical. And you remember last time we looked at the evangelist Paul Weston, who went into a London street and asked people why they didn't believe in God. And he came up with 6 main reasons, and then he wrote a book on it with a chapter for each reason. But we're turning the question around now, and we're saying, if someone asks you why you believe Christianity is true, what possible lines of argument could you use? So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. There's 9 of us here, so there should be 3 of you in each one. And then once you find yourself in your breakout room, just talk through this question. What lines of argument could you use to argue that Christianity is true? Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. That seemed to work. Okay. So what did you come up with? What reasons could you give for why you are a Christian?
If I may start, then
yeah, Hedwin.
I mentioned 3 things because I experienced it. I know my life before I was born again, and then after born again. So the first aspect is experience, and then the second one is historical, because Jesus is historical fact, and the third one is because the Bible is true, because we can prove that the Bible, we can trust and we can believe in the Bible. And then Claudia adds about the little details in creation, about the human body and the nature, ecosystem, and everything.
Great. Well, that's very comprehensive. So let's just pick that up. You could tell your testimony, and particularly the way your life has changed as a result of coming to know Christ.
Amen.
The history, and you mentioned both the Bible and, of course, the person of Christ, a real person of history, and then the nature of God and creation. Yep, that's pretty good. Anything else? Did other people come up with similar things? Anything else? You're nodding, Yasuko, so.
Yes, I would like to add, when we have that experience, that I think that we always got to that point that the main thing is that what God has done in our lives. And when we have this kind of relationship as well, the Lord becomes, he reveals to us, and he can shine in our lives, and people may see us, that we are normal human beings like them, but there's something about our lives different, and what that's something about our lives is Jesus, that they can see us acting and the way that we live, and they may see that there's a difference between them and us, and it's not something that can keep us apart, but can put us together, and that's Jesus.
Yeah, and that's very powerful, isn't it? And of course, Jesus talked in John 13 about, if you love one another, the world will know. And he also talked in John 17 in his prayer, Father, make them one so that the world will know. So the love of Christians for one another, I think especially powerfully across cultures and across different ethnicities, different backgrounds, and also the unity speaks volumes about the truth of the gospel. Okay, let me just come back to this slide again, and I would put it to you that there are 3 different ways that we can argue this, that we see in Scripture, and you've come up with all of them so far. And the first one was the last one that Hedwin mentioned, which is beauty and design in the natural order. Now, if you think of Psalm 19, it gives a beautiful description of both the universe and human beings themselves. So it says the heavens pour forth speech. They speak about God. Or Romans 1:19 and 20, God says that human beings have no excuse because his power and his creativity can be clearly seen in the things that have been made. So the beauty and design in the natural order is a very powerful argument for the existence of God. Of course, it doesn't tell us all the details about Christ, but it does point to a creator. And whether it's the biological complexity we see in human beings or in the animal or plant kingdoms, or whether it's the physical complexity that we see in the universe, both of them are very powerful indicators. So that's your first one, beauty and design in the natural order. And the second one, what we might call inner awareness or testimony, is this whole sense in which we come to know God personally. So Paul talks to the Athenians about in him we live and move and have our being in Acts 17. And in Romans 2, he talks about the fact that each of us has a conscience that tells us what's right and wrong and is an indicator of something beyond ourselves, a moral intelligence beyond ourselves, convicting us and teaching us and motivating us. So inner awareness or testimony, the way that God has changed our lives, what I was like before I met Christ, what I'm like after, and how I could never have brought about those changes myself. And of course, it's incredibly powerful when a non-Christian's friend gets converted and their life changes. And it can often lead to a domino effect where other people are brought into the kingdom as a result of that. And we certainly saw that in our medical school class when people changed dramatically after they've been converted. And then thirdly, we talked about history, but particularly God's revelation in Jesus Christ, that Jesus was a real person who lived in space-time history. He demonstrated by the words he spoke, by the claims he made, by the miracles he performed, and not the least his death and resurrection, that he was actually God in the flesh, God incarnate, God made man. So there's these three arguments. And the point I want to make is that there are three of them. There's not just one. So there are different approaches to this, but also that all three of these approaches are quite biblical. We see the apostles using them. We see them argued in scripture as well. And so it's valid for us to use all of these arguments. Now, the question I want to ask you, though, is if you think back to the 7 deadly questions that we looked at last time, and remember that you're doing this in the context of dialogue, you're having a conversation with someone so they can speak back to you. So they ask you, why do you believe? And you say, well, you tell your testimony, for example, or you talk about how wonderful creation is. Remember, you're in a conversation, and so they're going to respond to you. And what I want to ask you is how do you think they're going to respond, depending on which answer you give? So if I'm answering and saying, well, it's creation, then what questions are you immediately going to put on the agenda? If you say, look at how wonderful the world is, what are they going to come back and say to you?
If the world is so wonderful, why there's evil and bad things happen in the world?
Absolutely, of course they are. They're going to talk about plagues and earthquakes and wars and marital breakdown and COVID, aren't they? What other questions are they going to put on the agenda if you go for creation?
Big Bang.
Yeah, they might go for that. What about that would be one way of saying it, wouldn't it? Well, it's all due to the Big Bang, and that would they would say, well, that explains why the world's so physically complex. But if you talk about biological complexity, they're going to talk about evolution, aren't they? They're going to say, oh, well, it's all the product of random chance and gene mutation and genetic drift. And, haven't you been to university and learnt about these things? So the point is that the answer you give will shape the way the conversation goes. Do you see that? Now, what about if you tell your testimony or talk about experience or say, look, all these people's lives have changed for the better as a result of becoming Christians, and this is powerful evidence for the truth of Christianity. What questions are you putting on the agenda? What are they going to say? Remember, most of them who you're talking to, they're not going to want to be convinced, so they're going to come up with arguments that will stop them being convinced. What are they going to say if you go for experience?
They will bring about the life of others who are not a reflection of what is being taught.
Yes, so they might argue. They might go for one of Paul Weston's things, which was, look at all the hypocrisy in the church. If you look at all the hypocritical Christians and priests carrying out sexual and child abuse and so on, or Christians they know who've done bad things, but they might use that. But they might use it round the other way. They'll say, what about all these people who aren't Christians? And they all testify to a change in their lives as well. One day. So you're putting the question of the world's religions on the agenda. Well, my friend's a Hindu and he gets meaning and purpose out of that. Or my friend's a Muslim and he's very happy and gives a testimony just like yours. But you're also putting on the agenda this question, isn't it all psychological? Well, the reason you're a Christian is just because of the way you've been brought up. It's because of all the benefits you have. Goodness, if I believed that there was a God out there who made me and loved me and that I'd live forever with him and a new heaven and a new earth, then that's a really good reason for believing. And I think you just believe because you want to believe. You're putting that on the agenda. The other question, especially in a Western context, is this question of relativism, where you'll describe your testimony, give your evidence, and they'll just look back at you and say, "Oh, Hedwin, I'm so happy for you. I can see that Christianity has really helped you and that it gives your life, real meaning. It gives you a reason for living. I'm so happy for you." We're going to come back and look at that question later. They might add, well, Hedwin, I can see that that's true for you. But personally, I'm into Zen Buddhism or Confucianism or Zoroastrianism, or I'm just an atheist. Now, what if you go for Jesus Christ? What are you putting on the agenda there? What are they immediately going to bring up?
They can say there's no proof of his resurrection. He's alive.
They might well do, particularly if they're Muslims. But they might go even further than that and say there's no proof of his
lordship.
Yeah. Or even more than that.
Or his existence.
Even his existence. There's no proof that he performed miracles. There's no proof that he said these things. There's no proof that he died and rose from the dead. It's all a made-up story. It's a legend. And so immediately you're putting on the agenda this question of the reliability of the Gospels. How do we really know that Jesus existed and what he did, what he said to have done, he actually did, and so on. So whatever one of these questions you put on the agenda, the way you answer the question of why you believe in God will shape the discussion that follows. Now, if I ask you, if you had just 10 minutes to talk to a friend about Christianity, just 10 minutes, would you like to spend that time talking about creation, about your experience, or about Jesus Christ?
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, because it's a no-brainer question, isn't it? Because Jesus Christ is the absolute heart of our message. So that's what we want to talk about. So we need to be able to answer questions in a way that lead back to talking about the person of Jesus Christ. Now, I took a long time to learn this, and when I was at medical school, I often used to give testimony answers or creation answers. And I would spend hours and hours and hours as a result talking about Genesis and evolution. And I got quite good at talking about it. But I think in retrospect, I could have spent that time much more effectively by shaping the conversation towards Jesus Christ. Let me tell you about a friend of mine at medical school. His name was Derek, and he was not a believer when he came to medical school. And he got the lowest mark at school to get into medical school. So he was the very bottom student, and he got in on the strength of his interview. And the story was that he loved surfing, and he had his interview that day, and it was a very nice day at the beach, and he went to the beach to surf, and he was sitting there in the black iron sand on Auckland's west coast as the time for his interview came. And it was a beautiful sunny day, and he really thought, do I really want to go to this interview? Anyway, he decided he'd go, but he didn't leave himself enough time, and he turned up at the interview in short trousers and a t-shirt and flip-flops with black sand all over his feet, and he got in on the strength of the interview. He was a very good talker, and I think they thought maybe this is a guy who is so confident that he can turn up to an interview like this when everyone else comes in a suit and tie. Maybe we should take him. But so Derek got the lowest mark to get into medical school in our class. But in the final year, he won the medical prize. He came first in the class. And he won it on the strength of a viva, an oral exam that he had. And we had to, as I'm sure you do, had to examine a patient in front of examiners and then be questioned on it. And Derek had he always seemed to land on his feet, and he had this amazing opportunity when he came into the exam room and he saw the woman in the bed and recognized her as a patient that he'd had in his last ward attachment. And she was a woman who had aspergillosis, fungal spores, and she had a great big fungal spore in her right lung. And the only clinical sign on examination was dullness to percussion over the right clavicle. So when you tap the clavicle, there was a dull sound, you see. And so he was asked to examine the chest, and he did that. And then he turned around to the examiners and said right at the end, he said, I always make a point in examining the chest of percussing the clavicle. And so he then turned around and percussed the clavicle on each side and said, oh, there's dullness here and so on. And then, of course, they asked him the causes, and he knew all about aspergillosis. So he was able to lead them on to the areas that he knew something about. I later worked with a hematologist who also won the medical prize. He was a few years older than me, but he won the medical prize because he knew everything there was to know about a condition called hairy cell leukemia. Hairy cell leukemia, very rare. And he was fortunate enough to have a patient in the exam with an enlarged spleen. And so when he was asked for the causes of an enlarged spleen, he listed them all, but put hairy cell leukemia right at the end. And they asked him, of course, the next question was, tell me about hairy cell leukemia. And that was 5 minutes into a half-hour exam, and he was still talking about hairy cell leukemia 25 minutes later. And of course, the examiners assumed that he knew as much about everything as he did about hairy cell leukemia, which of course wasn't true at all. But you see, there's two funny examples of how people can lead conversations. And when we're talking about our faith, we've always got to think, what's the most important thing here? Well, it's Jesus. And so I want to get back to Jesus. And so that's the thing I should always be going for. And even though I might be able to talk for hours and hours about the world's religions and creation and evolution and the problem of suffering and evil and so on, and we need to be able to talk about those things, actually the most important thing is to talk about Jesus, because he is God in the flesh. He is what our faith's all about.